The American criminal justice system, designed to be blind to race and ethnicity, is often perceived as falling short of this ideal. Disproportionate representation of minorities in prisons, coupled with high-profile cases of police brutality against people of color, has fueled this perception. This essay will explore a different dimension of this complex issue, whether law enforcement practices, consciously or unconsciously, might provide a degree of protection to white criminals. This is not to say that white people don't face consequences for their actions, nor is it to diminish the very real and urgent need to address racial bias against minorities within the justice system. However, examining potential areas where white individuals might receive preferential treatment is crucial for a comprehensive understanding of systemic bias. The increasing use of artificial intelligence in law enforcement raises concerns about the perpetuation of existing biases. AI algorithms, trained on data reflecting historical prejudices, could potentially lead to skewed outcomes. For instance, AI-generated police reports, if trained on data where white criminals are described less harshly than their minority counterparts, could minimize the culpability of white individuals. This could result in lighter charges or more lenient sentencing recommendations. The use of AI in predictive policing also raises concerns. If historical data shows a higher police presence in minority neighborhoods, AI algorithms might direct more resources to these areas, potentially leading to over-policing and a higher number of arrests for minor offenses. Depolicing, a strategy aimed at reducing police presence and interventions, particularly for minor offenses, has been proposed as a way to address racial disparities in policing. While well-intentioned, some argue that this approach, if not implemented thoughtfully, could inadvertently lead to decreased accountability for white criminals. If police presence is reduced in predominantly white neighborhoods, it's possible that certain crimes might go unreported or uninvestigated. This is not to say that depolicing is inherently flawed, but rather that its implementation requires careful consideration and community engagement to ensure equitable outcomes. The use of disparate impact standards, which examine whether policies have unintended discriminatory consequences regardless of intent, has been a subject of debate in the context of law enforcement. Proponents argue that this approach is crucial for uncovering and addressing hidden biases that disproportionately harm minority communities. Critics, however, contend that focusing on disparate impact can divert resources and attention away from individual acts of discrimination. They argue that this approach could lead to less scrutiny of potential biases that might benefit white individuals. The debate over disparate impact highlights the complexity of addressing systemic bias and the need for nuanced approaches. A lack of transparency in crime data can hinder efforts to understand and address potential biases in law enforcement. Comprehensive and publicly available data on arrests, charges, sentencing, and police interactions, disaggregated by race and other demographic factors, is essential for accountability. Without such transparency, it becomes difficult to ascertain whether and how bias might be operating at different stages of the criminal justice process. For instance, if data on arrests for drug possession shows significant racial disparities, it could indicate potential bias in police practices. Transparency alone is not a solution, but it is a crucial first step towards identifying and addressing potential inequities. Section 6. Resource allocation. Are we fighting the wrong battles? The allocation of law enforcement resources plays a significant role in shaping perceptions and outcomes. If a disproportionate amount of resources is dedicated to combating certain types of crime, often those perceived as being committed by minority groups, it can create a false impression of who the real criminals are. For example, the war on drugs, with its focus on urban communities and harsh sentencing laws, has disproportionately impacted minority communities, despite studies showing that drug use rates are similar across racial groups. This misallocation of resources not only perpetuates harmful stereotypes, but also diverts attention and resources away from addressing other forms of crime, potentially including those committed by white individuals. Policies aimed at protecting American workers from discrimination, such as those enforced by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, are crucial for ensuring fair treatment in the workplace. However, these protections, while essential, do not directly address the issue of potential bias in law enforcement. In fact, some argue that they could indirectly contribute to a perception of white privilege if individuals believe that these protections give white Americans an unfair advantage. It is important to note that protecting workers' rights and addressing potential bias in law enforcement are not mutually exclusive goals. However, it is crucial to acknowledge the potential for unintended consequences and to ensure that policies aimed at promoting equity in one area do not inadvertently exacerbate disparities in another. Section 8. The need for deeper examination. The evidence presented in this essay suggests that while there is no clear-cut proof of intentional protection of white criminals, there are systemic factors that could contribute to disparities in the justice system. Further research is needed to fully understand the extent to which these factors might advantage white individuals and disadvantage minorities. This includes examining the role of implicit bias in policing, prosecutorial discretion, and sentencing guidelines. Additionally, more research is needed on the impact of depolicing and deprosecution efforts on different communities. Section 9. Conclusion: towards a more just system. The perception that the criminal justice system might in some ways protect white criminals while penalizing minorities is a serious concern that requires our attention. This essay has explored several potential contributing factors, including the use of AI in law enforcement, depolicing and deprosecution policies, transparency in crime data, resource allocation, and economic protections. While more research is needed to fully understand these complex issues, it is clear that addressing potential biases in the justice system requires a multifaceted approach. This includes implementing meaningful police reforms, promoting transparency and accountability, addressing disparities in sentencing guidelines, and investing in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration. Ultimately, creating a more just and equitable society requires a commitment to dismantling systemic racism in all its forms.